Worthless. The word hung in the air between us, dripping with disdain as Richard Maxwell, patriarch of Boston's financial elite, stared me down across the gleaming table of the River Oak Country Club. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over his perfectly tailored suit, his manicured hands wrapped around a glass of 30-year-old scotch as he dismissed my entire career with a single cutting remark. The gathered guests fell silent, cocktail conversations halting mid-sentence as they sensed the drama unfolding. Richard's wife Eleanor touched his arm in gentle warning, while my husband Thomas tensed beside me, caught between loyalty to his father and defense of his wife. None of them, not Richard with his empire of wealth, not the socialites whispering behind manicured hands, not even my own husband, knew that 3 weeks earlier, I had quietly purchased the entire debt portfolio of Maxwell Financial Holdings, effectively making me the shadow owner of Richard's crumbling financial kingdom. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My journey to that country club confrontation began 15 years earlier in a modest 3-bedroom house in Lakeside, a working-class neighborhood on Boston's outskirts. My father, a dedicated high school physics teacher who coached softball, on weekends, raised my brother James and me after our mother left when I was 9. We weren't poor, but we were firmly middle class. Family vacations meant road trips with packed lunches, and college funds came from Dad's summer school teaching gigs. Dad instilled in us a powerful work ethic and an even stronger sense of integrity. Success without character is failure in disguise, he'd say while helping with homework at our scratched kitchen table. His lessons shaped us, though James and I took different paths. 4 years older, James was always my protector and confidant, the one who made sure I was never bullied for my thrift store clothes or our second-hand car. When I was 17, my father was diagnosed with aggressive lymphoma. James had just started his finance degree at Boston University, but he immediately arranged a part-time schedule so he could help at home. "It's you and me now, Cass," he told me one night after a particularly rough hospital visit. "We stick together, no matter what." For the next year, James and I tag-teamed Dad's care while maintaining our own trajectories, me finishing high school with honors, him continuing college while working nights at an investment firm. When Dad went into remission, we celebrated with the first restaurant dinner we'd had in months. When he relapsed 6 months later, we created a system, James handling medical decisions and insurance battles, me managing the household and Dad's daily care. Dad fought hard, but by my high school graduation, he was gone. James and I stood together at the small funeral, his arm around my shoulders while we accepted condolences from Dad's students and colleagues. "We'll be okay," he promised. "We've got each other." And for years, that promise held. James excelled at Kingston Financial Services, climbing from analyst to associate to managing director with remarkable speed. His natural charisma and sharp financial instincts made him a rising star in Boston's financial sector. Meanwhile, I worked my way through community college and then Boston College's business program, waiting tables and building websites for local businesses to cover expenses that my scholarships didn't. My entrepreneurial journey started small. Failing coffee shop 3 blocks from campus that I purchased with my savings and a modest small business loan. I renovated it myself on weekends, transforming the tired space into Quantum Coffee, a vibrant community hub named after Dad's favorite physics principle. Within 18 months, I had doubled the revenue and expanded to a second location. James supported my ventures with both encouragement and practical advice, connecting me with my first business attorney and explaining financial statements over Sunday dinners at his increasingly upscale apartments. We remained close despite our different worlds, his high finance and corporate boardrooms, mine of small business loans and hands-on management. "You have a gift, Cass," he told me after I sold Quantum Coffee to a regional chain for an impressive profit. "You see potential where others see problems." My next venture, restoring a crumbling Victorian mansion into a boutique bed and breakfast, proved even more successful. I developed a reputation for revitalizing struggling businesses and neglected properties, turning them into thriving enterprises through a combination of strategic vision and relentless work ethic. But everything changed when James met Eleanor Maxwell at a charity gala. At 32, he was already a respected figure in Boston finance. Eleanor, a divorced socialite whose family had founded Maxwell Financial Holdings 3 generations earlier, was captivated by my brother's intelligence and drive. Within months, James was working directly for Richard Maxwell, Eleanor's brother and the current CEO of Maxwell Financial. The first time I met Eleanor at a dinner James hosted, her assessment of me was clinical and immediate. Small business. Development, she said when James proudly described my latest project. How determined of you. Though without proper connections, I imagine the ceiling is rather low. James laughed uncomfortably. Cass does things her own way. 3 successful businesses already. Well, determination certainly counts for something. Eleanor smiled thinly. Not everyone is suited for the larger financial world. James's integration into the Maxwell family business happened with startling speed. Within 6 months of meeting Eleanor, he was appointed Senior Vice President of Strategy at Maxwell Financial Holdings. Within a year, he had an office on the executive floor and a standing invitation to Richard Maxwell's exclusive weekend golf retreats in the Berkshires. I was happy for my brother's success, but concerned by the subtle changes in his demeanor. His casual confidence evolved into something more calculated, his speech peppered with references to the right schools and the right circles. Our Sunday dinners grew less frequent, replaced by rushed brunches where he checked his phone constantly, and spoke primarily about the Maxwell family's connections and influence. You wouldn't believe who Richard introduced me to yesterday, James would say, naming CEOs and politicians I vaguely recognized from news headlines. This is different from Kingston Financial, Cass. Maxwell moves markets. They don't just participate in the game. They make the rules. The change was most evident the night he invited me to a Maxwell Financial Holdings charity event at the Boston Symphony Hall. I'd invested in a dress that stretched my budget, determined to support James without embarrassing him. Just try to fit in, he texted that morning. These people are important to my future. The ballroom was intimidating. Crystal chandeliers, staff in formal attire, security discreetly positioned at every entrance. James greeted me with a quick hug, immediately steering me toward Richard and Eleanor Maxwell. Richard, you remember my sister Cassandra, James said, his voice carrying a tension I'd never heard before. Richard Maxwell was tall with silver hair and the unnaturally tanned complexion of someone who vacationed frequently on private islands. His handshake was brief, his assessment immediate. James speaks highly of your entrepreneurial efforts, he said, the pause suggesting my businesses were little more than lemonade stands in his estimation. Quite admirable to start small and stay connected to one's roots. Eleanor touched Richard's arm, a gesture I'd come to recognize as her way of guiding conversations. James mentioned you've sold another business. Quaint little ventures can be so fulfilling, can't they? Before I could respond about the significant profit margin of my quaint venture, a photographer approached. Mr. Maxwell, we'd like a photo. Of the executive team. Of course. Richard nodded to James. James, join us. As they positioned themselves for photos, Richard, Eleanor, James, and 6 other executives, I stood awkwardly to the side, suddenly invisible. The photographer gestured for me to step away from the background. That night marked the first time I truly understood that my brother was being absorbed into a world that had no place for me. Later, I overheard Eleanor speaking to another board member. James has exceptional potential. Rough around the edges. Certainly, his background is quite ordinary, but Richard is mentoring him personally. And the sister? The woman asked, glancing in my direction. A complication, Eleanor sighed. Family loyalties can be so limiting to true advancement. I was the complication. The unfortunate reminder of James's ordinary origins that needed to be managed and minimized. When James introduced me to Thomas Maxwell 3 months later, I had no idea he was Richard's son, recently returned from managing the company's European operations. Unlike his father and aunt, Thomas was quietly intense, more interested in architecture and historical preservation than financial domination. He approached me at another charity event, asking thoughtful questions about my business renovating historic properties into modern commercial spaces. "That's actually fascinating," he said when I described my current project, transforming an abandoned factory into artist lofts and retail space. Most developers just demolish and rebuild without considering the architectural heritage. Our connection was immediate and unexpected. Thomas understood my passion for finding beauty and potential in neglected spaces. I appreciated his genuine interest in preservation and community impact, rather than merely maximizing profit. We began meeting for coffee, then dinners, then weekend trips to explore historic sites across New England. James was stunned when our relationship turned serious. "Thomas Maxwell, are you sure this is a good idea, Cass?" "Why wouldn't it be?" I challenged myself. "Because he comes from money and I don't?" "Because his father is Richard Maxwell," James replied, lowering his voice, though we were alone in my apartment. "Richard has specific expectations for his son's future. He doesn't make allowances for deviations from his plan." "I'm a deviation?" James sighed, running his hand through his now perfectly styled hair. "You know what I mean. The Maxwells have a certain way of doing things. Family alliances are strategic. Thomas is being groomed to take over the North American division." "Thomas isn't his father?" I replied firmly. "He values different things. That's what worries me," James muttered. Despite my brother's concerns, Thomas and I grew closer. While Richard and Eleanor clearly disapproved, they maintained a chilly politeness when I attended family functions. Thomas seemed oblivious to their subtle digs and dismissive comments, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore the tension. His focus remained on our shared interests: historic architecture, community development, sustainability, and urban planning. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, the Maxwell family's reaction was predictably mixed. Eleanor organized an engagement dinner at River Oak Country Club, their ancestral domain of privilege. The evening was a masterclass in passive aggression, from the placement of my name card at the far end of the table to Eleanor's toast that praised Thomas for his compassionate nature, while pointedly avoiding any mention of my accomplishments. After dinner, I overheard Richard speaking to Thomas near the bar. "She's not what we expected for you," Richard said, his voice low but carrying. "The Maxwell name opens doors that would otherwise remain closed. Your future at the company is not contingent on who I marry," Thomas interrupted firmly. "Cassandra builds businesses from nothing. She sees potential where others don't. That's exactly the fresh perspective Maxwell Financial needs." Richard's laugh was condescending. "Retail coffee shops and boutique renovations hardly qualify as relevant experience for a global financial institution. Then it's fortunate I'm marrying her for love, not her resume," Thomas replied, ending the conversation by walking away. I married Thomas 6 months later in a ceremony that reflected our values rather than Maxwell traditions: a restored historic theater instead of River Oak Country Club, locally sourced catering instead of imported delicacies, a celebration focused on community rather than exclusivity. Richard and Eleanor attended with visibly strained smiles, clearly embarrassed by the lack of ostentation. James served as Thomas's best man, a bridge between our worlds that seemed increasingly symbolic. During the reception, I found my brother, standing alone on the theater's restored balcony, staring pensively at the celebration below. Having second thoughts about your toast? I teased, joining him at the railing. No, he smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Just thinking about, Dad, how proud he'd be of you. He hesitated. And how worried. Worried? Why? Because I know the Maxwells, Cass. I work with Richard every day. He doesn't accept defeat, especially not in family matters. James turned to face me fully. Thomas bucking family expectations by marrying you. That's not something Richard will simply accept and move past. I'm not marrying Richard, I reminded him. Thomas and I will build our own life. James nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Just promise me you'll be careful. The Maxwells play by different rules. Money isn't just wealth to them. It's power, identity, control. His warning seemed melodramatic at the time, but as the years passed, I would come to understand exactly what he meant and why it mattered so much. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The first 2 years of marriage to Thomas were a careful balancing act. We purchased a Victorian brownstone in Cambridge, close enough to Boston for Thomas's commute to Maxwell Financial Holdings, but removed from the Beacon Hill enclave where most Maxwell executives lived. I continued building my redevelopment business, Horizon Ventures, focusing on historic properties while Thomas worked in the family company's sustainable investment division, a relatively new branch that Richard tolerated rather than embraced. Our Sunday brunches with Richard and Eleanor became a monthly obligation that Thomas insisted we maintain. Family connections matter to them, he explained after one particularly tense gathering where Richard had questioned every decision I'd made on my latest restoration project. They'll come around eventually. I wasn't so certain. Richard's dismissal of my work never softened, merely evolved into more sophisticated forms of condescension. Community-focused development is admirable charity work, he would say, examining his perfect manicure while I explained a complex adaptive reuse project. Though real estate should ultimately maximize return on investment, not social engagement. Eleanor was more subtle, her disapproval wrapped in concern. Darling, these projects in transitional neighborhoods, aren't you worried about Thomas's family name being associated with such experimental ventures? Thomas defended me consistently, pointing out that my experimental projects consistently outperformed market projections while creating jobs and preserving architectural heritage. His support, while genuine, only seemed to deepen Richard's resentment, as if Thomas choosing me over his father's values was an ongoing betrayal. James, meanwhile, had become fully immersed in the Maxwell orbit. Promoted to executive vice president, he now lived in a luxury high-rise, drove a custom Aston Martin, and vacationed on private islands with clients. Our once close relationship had dwindled to occasional text messages and awkward holiday gatherings. When we did meet, he seemed torn between his role as a Maxwell executive and his identity as my brother. Richard respects results, James told me during a rare dinner together, after I mentioned another uncomfortable interaction with my father-in-law. Maybe focus on projects with higher profit margins, more prestigious locations. Show him you understand the Maxwell approach to business. I'm not going to change my business model to impress Richard, I replied, surprised by his suggestion. My approach works. It's profitable and makes a positive impact. James sighed, signaling for another scotch from a hovering waiter. You don't understand, Cass. The Maxwells aren't just wealthy. They're institutional. They think in terms of legacy, influence, generations. Richard sees your community-focused projects as a reflection on the family brand. My work has nothing to do with Maxwell Financial. Everything connected to the Maxwell name has to do with Maxwell Financial, James countered, lowering his voice. Richard built that company into what it is through absolute control of the narrative. The right schools, the right clubs, the right marriages, the right businesses. It's all part of a carefully constructed image. And I don't fit the image, I stated flatly. James didn't deny it. You could if you wanted to. It would make things easier for Thomas. And for you. The suggestion that I should reshape myself to fit Richard's expectations stung, especially coming from my brother. Dad wouldn't recognize you right now, I said quietly. Pain flashed across James's face. That's not fair, Cass. Isn't it? What happened to we stick together? To succeed with integrity? The world is more complicated than Dad's kitchen table philosophy, James replied, his voice hardening. I've built something significant at Maxwell Financial. I've earned my place. By becoming exactly what Richard wanted, I observed. James signaled for the check, effectively ending our conversation. You could try meeting them halfway, you know. Not everything has to be a battle of principles. As James and I grew further apart, a surprising alliance formed between Thomas and my close friend and business partner Mia Chen, a brilliant architect. With a background in urban planning, Mia had worked with me on several projects before joining Horizon Ventures full-time. Initially wary of Thomas's Maxwell connections, she gradually recognized his genuine commitment to sustainable development. He's nothing like his father, Mia told me one evening, as we reviewed plans for converting an abandoned textile mill into mixed-income housing. Though I still don't understand how Richard Maxwell produced someone with an actual social conscience. Nature versus nurture, Thomas suggested, joining our conversation with fresh coffee. Or possibly rebellion. Every family dynasty has at least one disappointment. His self-deprecating smile couldn't hide the underlying truth. In Richard's eyes, Thomas's values were a direct challenge to the Maxwell legacy. This tension came to a head during the economic downturn that struck 3 years into our marriage. Several major financial institutions faced significant losses as the real estate market contracted. Maxwell Financial Holdings, however, reported record profits, fueling speculation about their investment strategies. At a tense family dinner, Richard claimed these results validated his approach. Conservative, strategic, and exclusive, he declared, raising his wine glass in self-congratulation. While others chased popular trends, we maintained our focus on elite markets and premium clients. Interesting timing, Thomas remarked casually. Considering the report I received from our sustainability audit shows, Maxwell Financial shifted significant assets into high-risk ventures just before the downturn. Richard's expression hardened. Internal reports aren't dinner conversation, Thomas. Neither is taking credit for success while hiding questionable practices, Thomas replied evenly. The Sustainable Investment Division hasn't seen any of these record profits you're reporting to shareholders. Eleanor intervened smoothly, steering the conversation toward safer topics, but the damage was done. The drive home was silent until Thomas finally spoke. They're manipulating the numbers, Cass. I've suspected it for months, but now I'm certain. That's a serious accusation, I said carefully. What exactly do you think is happening? Classic financial sleight of hand, moving assets between subsidiaries, temporarily inflating values, possibly even hiding losses in offshore entities. Dad's using the Maxwell reputation to project stability while taking incredible risks behind the scenes. The implications were staggering. Have you talked to James about this? Thomas shook his head. James is completely loyal to my father now. He's been put in charge of their new acquisition strategy, buying up struggling companies at bargain prices. Which companies? I asked. Professional curiosity piqued. That's the strange part. They're not typical Maxwell targets. Smaller firms, diverse sectors, no obvious pattern. Thomas frowned. It feels like they're building some kind of financial house of cards, but I can't see the full structure yet. His concerns prompted me to dig deeper into Maxwell Financial's public filings and market activities. What I discovered disturbed me. A pattern of aggressive expansion masked by complex financial structures, with Richard apparently betting heavily. against the same markets he publicly praised. I shared my findings with Mia, who had an unexpected connection. "My cousin works at Sentinel Partners," she said, referring to a respected financial analysis firm. "She's been tracking unusual activity at several major institutions, including Maxwell Financial. Apparently, they've taken on massive debt to fund these new acquisitions." "Debt?" I repeated, surprised. Richard Maxwell was famously debt-averse, often boasting that Maxwell Financial's strength came from its impeccable balance sheet. "Not just regular debt," Mia continued. "High-interest, short-term obligations hidden within subsidiary structures. If their new acquisitions don't perform exactly as projected, the entire framework could collapse." The information gnawed at me. If true, it meant Richard was gambling with not just the Maxwell fortune, but the livelihoods of thousands of employees across dozens of companies. It also meant Thomas's career was built on increasingly unstable ground. My concern deepened when James unexpectedly canceled our long-scheduled lunch with a cryptic text. "Too much happening. Maxwell Financial in transition mode. Will explain when I can." That evening, I found Thomas in his home office, surrounded by financial reports and looking uncharacteristically troubled. "Something big is happening," he said without preamble. "Dad's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. Closed door, no electronic devices. James is acting strange. Canceled our weekly review session, won't answer direct questions." I hesitated, then shared what Mia had told me about Maxwell Financial's hidden debt structure. Thomas listened intently, his expression growing darker. "If that's accurate, they're far more vulnerable than anyone realizes." He stood, pacing our study. "Cass, I need to understand exactly what's happening before that board meeting." "What are you thinking?" I asked, recognizing his determined expression. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that it might be time to use my name for something my father never intended, exposing the truth about Maxwell Financial Holdings." The morning after our conversation about Maxwell Financial's troubling financial maneuvers, Thomas received an unexpected call from his father's executive assistant. "Mr. Maxwell requests your presence at his home office. Immediately." Thomas exchanged a concerned glance with me. "Did my father say what this is regarding?" "No, sir. Just that it's urgent and confidential." After Thomas left, I called Mia to postpone our site visit at the textile mill project. "Something's happening with Maxwell Financial." Thomas was summoned to Richard's house. "That can't be good timing," Mia replied. "My cousin at Sentinel Partners texted me last night. They're preparing a major report on financial irregularities at several institutions, including Maxwell Financial." "How serious?" "Serious enough that Sentinel's legal team is reviewing every paragraph before publication." Mia hesitated. "There's something else. Remember Parkview Investments? The firm that specializes in distressed debt? The vulture capitalists? What about them?" "They've been quietly accumulating Maxwell Financial's debt instruments through various shell companies. My cousin thinks they're positioning for a hostile takeover if the Sentinel report triggers a stock price collapse." The implications were staggering. Richard Maxwell, the man who prided himself on financial dominance, might be losing control of his own company through the very debt he claimed never to rely on. "Cass, you need to warn Thomas," Mia urged. "If Richard is calling him in, it could mean he's looking for someone to blame when this all explodes." Before I could respond, my phone lit up with a text from James. "Need to talk. Not at the office or home. Meet at Dad's old boathouse? 1 p.m. The request was strange enough to be concerning. James hadn't mentioned our father or his modest lakeside property in years, and specifically avoiding both his office and home suggested he feared being monitored. I drove to Lake Merrimack that afternoon, finding the small boathouse exactly as we'd left it years ago. Dad's old fishing equipment still hung on the walls, his battered rowboat covered with a tarp in the corner. The familiar scent of cedar and lake water triggered memories of simpler times, Weekend fishing trips, Dad teaching us to row, sunset, picnics on the weathered dock. James arrived 15 minutes late, his luxury sedan looking out of place on the gravel path. He'd abandoned his usual tailored suit for jeans and a sweatshirt, his hair unstyled, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. "Thanks for coming," he said, glancing over his shoulder before entering the boathouse. "I couldn't risk being overheard." "James, what's going on? You're scaring me." He paced the small space, running his hands through his hair in a gesture reminiscent of our father. "Everything's collapsing, Cass. All of it. Richard's empire, my career, possibly even Maxwell Financial itself." "The hidden debt structures?" I asked. James stopped pacing, staring at me in shock. "How do you know about that?" "Thomas has been concerned about financial irregularities for months." I did some research. "It's worse than irregularities," James said, his voice dropping. "Richard's been lying to the board, to shareholders, to regulators. He's built a complex shell game, moving assets and liabilities between subsidiaries to create the illusion of stability while taking enormous risks." "Why would he do that? Maxwell Financial has always been conservative, risk-averse." James laughed bitterly. "That was the public image. The reality? Richard's been gambling big for years, trying to maintain the lifestyle and influence the family. Expects the Boston mansion, the Nantucket compound, Eleanor's philanthropy, the board seats at cultural institutions. It all requires cash flow. Lots of it. And the gambling didn't pay off, I guessed. Some did. Enough to keep the scheme running. But the latest venture..." James shook his head. "Richard convinced the board to acquire Meridian Holdings, a massive conglomerate with diversified assets. On paper, it looked like a perfect acquisition. Stable income streams, complementary business units, minimal overlap. But Meridian was hiding its own problems. Massive pension obligations, environmental liabilities, underperforming divisions propped up by creative accounting. By the time our due diligence team discovered the issues, Richard had already committed Maxwell Financial to the acquisition. I sat on Dad's old workbench, trying to process the implications. So, Maxwell Financial is now responsible for Meridian's liabilities? Plus, the enormous debt Richard took on to finance the acquisition, James confirmed. The interest payments alone are unsustainable without significant asset sales or outside investment. Does the board know? Richard's been keeping them in the dark. The full extent of the problem is contained in a single report that only Richard, Eleanor, and I have seen. James rubbed his temples. That's why I needed to talk to you somewhere secure. Richard called Thomas this morning to present him with an ultimatum. My stomach tightened. What kind of ultimatum? Richard needs a scapegoat. Someone to blame when this all becomes public. He's planning to claim that Thomas's sustainable investment division made unauthorized high-risk investments, that Thomas exceeded his authority. That's ridiculous, I protested. Thomas has been fighting for more conservative approaches, not riskier ones. Evidence can be created, Cass. Richard has already instructed IT to modify certain records. By the time regulators step in, it'll look like Thomas made the disastrous decisions. The calculated cruelty of it shocked me. His own son. He would sacrifice his own son to protect himself. Richard protects the Maxwell name above all else, James said wearily. In his mind, he is Maxwell Financial. Thomas is expendable, especially since he's never fully embraced Richard's vision. What's Richard offering in exchange for Thomas taking the fall? Financial security. If Thomas agrees to resign and accept responsibility for investment strategies that didn't perform as expected, Richard will ensure he's financially secure through offshore accounts that can't be traced or seized. I stood, anger replacing my initial shock. And if Thomas refuses? Richard will destroy him professionally. Every connection, every reference, every opportunity in finance will vanish. Richard will make sure Thomas never works in the industry again and possibly face regulatory investigation for actions he never took. Why are you telling me this, James? You've been Richard's right hand for years. Why turn against him now? James looked away, staring at Dad's fishing gear hanging on the wall. Because Dad would be ashamed of what I've become, what I've allowed to happen. His voice cracked slightly. I've spent years justifying every compromise, telling myself it was necessary for success. But this, setting up Thomas to take the fall for Richard's failures? I can't be part of it. The admission seemed to physically diminish him, as if acknowledging his moral failure had extracted some essential energy. For the first time in years, I recognized my brother beneath the polished Maxwell executive. What did Thomas say to Richard's proposal? I asked. He refused immediately, said he wouldn't participate in fraud, regardless of the consequences. A hint of admiration colored James's voice. Richard was furious. I've never seen him so coldly angry. He told Thomas to reconsider, that by tomorrow's board meeting he'd need an answer, compliance or career suicide. Thomas would never agree to this, I said confidently. That's why I'm here, Cass. Richard won't stop with Thomas's career. He'll come after everything. Your marriage, your business, your reputation. When Richard Maxwell declares war, he doesn't leave survivors. I absorbed this, the full implications slowly crystallizing. So what are you suggesting? James took a deep breath. I have access to the real financial records, the ones showing exactly what Richard has done. I can provide them to the right authorities, but it would mean ending my career at Maxwell Financial. Probably my career in finance entirely. You would do that? I asked, studying my brother carefully. I've been asking myself what Dad would do. James replied quietly. I think I finally know the answer. As we stood in our father's boathouse, surrounded by memories of a simpler, more principled life, I realized we were facing a turning point that would reshape all our futures. Whatever happened next, the carefully constructed world of Maxwell Financial Holdings was about to change forever. I drove directly from the boathouse to meet Thomas at our favorite coffee shop in Cambridge, a neutral location where we could speak freely without fear of Maxwell surveillance. He was already waiting at our usual corner table, his expression grim but resolved. Richard wants me to take the fall, he said without preamble as I sat down. He's fabricating evidence to make it look like my division made unauthorized investments. That crippled the company. James told me, I replied, reaching for his hand across the table. He's willing to come forward with the real records. Thomas's eyebrows rose in surprise. James would turn against my father? After everything he's invested in becoming Richard's protégé? I think seeing Richard's willingness to sacrifice you, his own son, finally crossed a line for James. He mentioned our father, said he's been asking himself what Dad would do. A hint of a smile crossed Thomas's face. Your father would have marched into Richard's office and told him exactly what he thought of his ethics. Consequences be damned. Probably, I agreed. But we need a more strategic approach. If James provides evidence and you refuse to be the scapegoat, Richard could still cause tremendous damage before the truth comes out. The barista delivered our coffees, giving us a moment to collect our thoughts. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of Maxwell Financial's headquarters. There's another factor we haven't discussed, Thomas said once we were alone again. Mia's information about Parkview Investments accumulating Maxwell Financial's debt. If they're positioning for a hostile takeover, the timing of the Sentinel Partners report could trigger exactly the stock collapse they're waiting for. I nodded slowly, an idea beginning to form. What if we got ahead of both? What if we controlled the narrative and the debt? Thomas tilted his head, studying me with newfound interest. What are you thinking, Cass? Parkview Investments is buying Maxwell Financial's debt through shell companies because they want to remain anonymous until they're ready to strike, I explained. the plan crystallizing as I spoke. But debt instruments are ultimately just financial products for sale on the market. You want to buy the debt? Thomas asked incredulously. Cass, we're talking about hundreds of millions, possibly billions. Not personally, I clarified. But Horizon Ventures has partners, investors who trust my judgment. If we combined resources with some of my larger investors, we could potentially secure a significant portion of the debt. Not all of it, but enough to have leverage. Thomas leaned forward, lowering his voice. Even if that were possible, what would it achieve? Control, I said simply. Whoever holds Maxwell Financial's debt when the Sentinel report breaks will have enormous influence over the company's future. If it's Parkview, they'll strip assets and destroy the company for quick profit. If it's us, we could potentially negotiate a restructuring that preserves the viable parts of the business and jobs, Thomas finished, catching my vision. But Richard would never agree to outside interference, especially from you. He might if the alternative is complete collapse and public humiliation, I countered. And we wouldn't be acting alone. With James providing evidence of the real financial situation and you refusing to be the scapegoat, Richard would be facing legal exposure as well as financial ruin. Thomas drummed his fingers on the table, considering the angles. It's audacious, possibly insane, but it might be our best option. He hesitated. Using financial leverage against my father, it's exactly the kind of power play he would execute himself. With one critical difference, I pointed out. We'd be doing it to prevent destruction, not cause it. We spent the next hour outlining our strategy, identifying potential allies and resources. By the time we left the coffee shop, we had the B framework of a plan that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. First, we needed to verify exactly which entities held Maxwell Financial's debt and how much was available for purchase. For this, we turned to Mia's cousin at Sentinel Partners, who agreed to provide confidential information in exchange for a guarantee that any debt we acquired would be used responsibly. Parkview has secured approximately 30% of Maxwell Financial's outstanding obligations, she reported during a secure call that evening. The remaining 70% is distributed among various creditors, many of whom are getting nervous based on preliminary findings from our investigation. Meaning they might be willing to sell at a discount, Thomas noted. Especially if approached by entities not obviously connected to Maxwell Financial, she confirmed. The next step was assembling the financial resources to execute our plan. I spent the evening calling trusted investors who had backed my previous ventures, carefully explaining the opportunity without revealing all the details. It's a distressed debt acquisition with significant upside potential, I told Jackson Ward, a venture capitalist who had funded two of my most successful redevelopment projects. I can't share the target company yet, but I can guarantee the debt is secured by substantial physical assets. This is outside your usual wheelhouse, Cassandra, Jackson observed. What's the real play here? Preservation with purpose, I replied. Using our shared shorthand for ventures that saved historic properties while creating new value. The target company has solid underlying assets and operations. Its current distress is due to management decisions, not fundamental business weakness. By midnight, I had secured preliminary commitments for enough capital to make our plan viable. Meanwhile, Thomas contacted discreet legal advisors to structure the acquisition vehicles that would shield our identities during the debt purchases. James called early the next morning, his voice tense. Richards moved up the board meeting to 3 p.m. today. He's gathering allies, preparing to present his version of events before anyone can challenge it. We need more time, I said, calculating how quickly we could execute our debt acquisition strategy. I can delay, create some procedural obstacles, but not for long, James replied. What exactly are you and Thomas planning? I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. James sensed my hesitation. Cass, I'm all in now. Whatever you're planning, I want to help. I've spent too long enabling Richard's worst impulses. We're trying to secure control of Maxwell Financial's debt before the Sentinel report breaks, I explained. If we succeed, We'll have leverage to force restructuring rather than destruction. A long silence followed. That's ambitious, James finally said. But Richard's debt is structured through dozens of subsidiaries and shell companies. Even identifying all the debt holders would take weeks without inside information. Which is why we need your help, I acknowledged. You have access to the real financial records. You know where the bodies are buried. Another pause. I do. And I can map the entire debt structure for you. But Cass, even if you succeed, Richard will see this as the ultimate betrayal. From both of us. He was willing to sacrifice his own son to protect himself, I reminded him. I think we're past worrying about Richard's feelings. You're right, James sighed. I'll send you everything I have on the debt structure and postpone the board meeting as long as possible. But you should know, Richard has already instructed security to bar Thomas from the building. He's moving faster than we anticipated. After hanging up, I found Thomas in our home office, already working with our hastily assembled team of financial analysts and lawyers. When I shared James's warning, his expression hardened. So my father's not even pretending anymore, he said, his voice flat. He's already executing his plan to erase me from Maxwell Financial. Which means we need to move even faster, I replied, laying out the documents James had sent. A comprehensive map of Maxwell Financial's complex debt structures. James gave us everything. Now we just need to execute before Richard realizes what's happening. The next 10 hours were a blur of activity. Conference calls with investors, rapid-fire negotiations with debt holders, legal documents prepared and signed in real time. We worked from our home, converting our dining room into a command center. For what amounted to a financial rescue mission, or possibly a hostile takeover, depending on one's perspective. By 2 p.m., an hour before the rescheduled board meeting, we had secured controlling positions in enough of Maxwell Financial's debt to ensure we would have significant leverage when the Sentinel report broke. The final piece came when Mia called with unexpected news. My contact at Parkview Investments just reached out. They know someone else is buying up Maxwell debt and they're curious about our intentions. What did you tell them? I asked, surprised that our moves had been detected so quickly. That their vulture capitalism approach wasn't aligned with our investor group's values, Mia replied. They countered with an interesting proposition. They'll sell us their 30% stake at just above their acquisition cost if we guarantee certain divisions remain intact. They're cutting their losses, Thomas observed. They recognize that someone with insider knowledge is moving against them, and they're looking for a clean exit. Exactly, Mia confirmed. Do we accept? I glanced at Thomas, who nodded decisively. Accept? Their offer, I instructed. And Mia? Tell them we'll need the transfer completed before 3 p.m. today. As I hung up, Thomas's phone rang. Eleanor Maxwell calling. He put it on speaker. Thomas, where are you? Her voice carried unusual urgency. The board meeting starts in 30 minutes, and your father expects you to be present. I understand. I've been barred from the building, Thomas replied calmly. A miscommunication, Eleanor dismissed. Richard insists you attend. He says there's a solution that will protect everyone's interests. Thomas and I exchanged knowing looks. Richard must have discovered some hint of our activities and was changing tactics. I'll be there, Thomas promised. As he ended the call, he turned to me. It's time to confront my father. Are you ready? I glanced at the confirmation emails showing our newly acquired debt positions in Maxwell Financial Holdings. More than ready. Let's go show Richard Maxwell what worthless really looks like. Maxwell Financial Holdings occupied the top 10. Floors of a gleaming glass tower in downtown Boston, its lobby a cathedral to modern wealth, soaring ceilings, marble floors, and a massive sculpture representing financial ascension, according to the plaque. As Thomas and I passed through security, I noted the subtle shift in the guards' demeanor. The usual deference to Thomas tinged with uncertainty, as if they sensed the power dynamics were shifting. Mr. Maxwell is expecting you in the executive boardroom, the receptionist informed Thomas, deliberately ignoring my presence despite having checked in both of us. Shall I tell him you've arrived? Tell him we've arrived, Thomas corrected firmly. My wife will be joining the meeting. The receptionist's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. I wasn't informed of additional attendees. The board meeting is restricted to directors and specifically invited guests. My wife has information directly relevant to the financial matters being discussed, Thomas replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. If there's a concern, your supervisor can take it up with the board directly. The woman's professional smile tightened as she made the call. After a brief, tense conversation, she nodded reluctantly. You may both proceed to the 50th floor. In the elevator, Thomas squeezed my hand. Ready for this? I've been ready since the first time Richard dismissed me at a family dinner, I replied, straightening my shoulders. The question is whether he's ready for us. The executive boardroom occupied the northeast corner of the 50th floor, offering panoramic views of Boston Harbor through floor-to-ceiling windows. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs occupied by Maxwell Financial's power brokers. Older men in bespoke suits mixed with a few younger executives clearly chosen for their loyalty to Richard rather than their innovation. Richard sat at the head of the table, Eleanor to his right, James to his left. All three looked up as we entered, their expressions revealing different calculations. Richard's cold anger, Eleanor's careful neutrality, James's carefully concealed relief. Thomas, Richard acknowledged with a curt nod before fixing his gaze on me. This is a closed board meeting. Family ties don't grant automatic access to confidential corporate matters. Before Thomas could respond, the boardroom door opened again, admitting a harried-looking man clutching a leather portfolio. Mr. Maxwell, I apologize for the interruption, but we've received urgent information regarding our debt positions. Richard's expression flickered. Annoyance mingled with concern. Harrison, this can wait until after— It cannot wait, sir. The man insisted, an unusual backbone showing in his posture. Multiple creditors have reported ownership transfers of our outstanding obligations. Over 70% of Maxwell Financial's debt has changed hands in the past 8 hours. A murmur of concern spread around the table. Richard's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on his pen. Parkview Investments? He asked, naming the vulture capital firm he expected. No, sir. The acquiring entities appear to be a consortium of LLCs and investment vehicles we can't immediately trace. Richard's gaze swung to me, sudden understanding dawning in his eyes. Everyone out, he ordered sharply. Except the board, Thomas, and— A fractional pause. His wife. As the room cleared, leaving only the 7 board members, Thomas, James, Eleanor, and myself, Richard leaned forward. What have you done? He demanded, any pretense of civility evaporating. Protect our interests, Thomas replied evenly. Just as you taught me. By conspiring against your own family? Your own company? Richard's voice remained controlled, but fury radiated from every syllable. Interesting perspective from someone who planned to make me the scapegoat for his financial misconduct, Thomas countered, placing a folder on the table. These are the actual financial records of Maxwell Financial Holdings, showing the true extent of our exposure and the high-risk strategies employed under your direction. The board members exchanged alarmed glances. Eleanor's perfectly maintained composure showed its first crack, a slight widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible tension in her shoulders. This is absurd, Richard declared, though he made no move to open the folder. Thomas is attempting to deflect attention from his own mismanagement of the Sustainable Investment Division. Actually, James interjected, sliding another folder onto the table, these documents show that Thomas's division is one of the few consistently profitable segments of Maxwell Financial at present. The losses are concentrated in the special OR acquisition vehicles you personally directed, Richard. Richard's gaze snapped to James, betrayal and fury warring in his expression. You too? After everything I've done for you? Because of everything you've done, James corrected quietly, including what you plan to do to Thomas. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman with shrewd eyes, reached for the folders. I believe the board should review these materials. Immediately. That won't be necessary, Victoria, Richard said smoothly, recovering his poise. This is clearly a family disagreement that has inappropriately spilled into the boardroom. Whatever documentation Thomas and James think they have is incomplete and misleading. Actually, I spoke for the first time since entering. The documentation is quite thorough, as is the report Sentinel Partners will release tomorrow morning detailing Maxwell Financial's accounting irregularities, hidden liabilities, and misrepresented assets. Richard's focus shifted to me, contempt overtaking anger. And now the coffee shop manager thinks she understands corporate finance. This grows more farcical by the minute. The farcical part, I replied calmly, is that you still don't recognize the position you're in. The consortium that now controls over 70% of Maxwell Financial's debt isn't Parkview Investments. It's an investment group I assembled in the past 24 hours. Silence descended on the room as the implications sank in. Eleanor recovered first, her social training allowing her to maintain outward composure. What exactly are you suggesting, Cassandra? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. When Sentinel Partners releases their report tomorrow, Maxwell Financial's stock will collapse. Creditors will call in loans that cannot be repaid with current liquid assets. Under normal circumstances, this would trigger either bankruptcy or a fire sale of assets. Victoria leaned forward. And under these circumstances, the debt holders could agree to a structured reorganization, I explained. One that preserves the viable operations of Maxwell Financial, maintains employment for thousands of workers, and avoids the complete destruction of the company's value. At what cost? Another board member asked. Leadership change, Thomas stated simply. My father steps down, along with any executives who participated in the financial misrepresentations. The board is restructured with independent directors. The company is recapitalized with transparency as its guiding principle. Richard laughed, the sound echoing harshly in the tense room. You expect me to surrender control of my company, a company I built over 30 years, to my disobedient son and his shopkeeper wife? Your alternative is watching Maxwell Financial collapse entirely, Thomas replied. The Sentinel report can't be stopped. The debt obligations can't be met without our cooperation. Those are the facts, regardless of how you feel about who's presenting them. The board members exchanged glances, the reality of the situation becoming clear. Victoria cleared her throat. I believe the board should discuss these matters privately. Richard, perhaps you and your family could step outside while we review the documentation and consider our options. Richard stood abruptly. This is still my company. I don't take orders from— Sit down, Richard, Victoria interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. Your family has presented serious allegations with apparently substantial documentation. The board has a fiduciary duty to consider this information, regardless of your personal feelings. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, Richard Maxwell found himself outmaneuvered. His gaze swept the room, finding no allies strong enough to challenge Victoria's authority as lead independent director. Fine, he snapped, dropping back into his chair. Review whatever fabricated documents they've presented. The board will discover that everything I've done has been to preserve and strengthen Maxwell Financial. Including setting up your son to take the blame for your failures? James asked quietly. Richard's expression hardened. Family loyalty used to mean something. It still does, Thomas replied. Just not in the way you define it. Victoria gestured toward the door. If you would all please step outside, we'll begin our review immediately. As we filed out of the boardroom into the adjacent executive lounge, the tension that had been contained by the formal setting of the board meeting exploded into the open. "You backstabbing ingrates," Richard hissed, rounding on Thomas and James, once the door closed. 30 years building this company, giving both of you opportunities beyond your worth, and this is how you repay me? Opportunities beyond our worth? Thomas repeated incredulously. I earned my position through performance. James transformed your acquisition strategy. We contributed value that you're now trying to erase to save yourself. Richard's attention swung to me, finding an easier target for his rage. This is what you're doing. You've never accepted your place. Always pushing, questioning, undermining my authority with Thomas. You couldn't stand that he had opportunities beyond your little community projects, so you had to drag him down to your level. I met his gaze steadily. Is that what you think this is about? Status? Position? This is about integrity, Richard. About responsibility. About not sacrificing thousands of employees to protect your ego. Eleanor stepped between us, ever the mediator of Maxwell conflicts. There must be a less destructive resolution. Surely we can find a compromise that preserves the family and the company. The time for compromise was before Richard decided to make Thomas his scapegoat, I replied. Now we're simply ensuring accountability. As Eleanor tried to respond, the boardroom door opened. Victoria stood in the doorway, her expression grave. The board requests that Richard and Thomas return, she announced. We've reached our preliminary decision. Thomas and Richard entered the boardroom while James, Eleanor, and I remained in the executive lounge. The tension was palpable, the three of us forming an uneasy triangle of conflicting loyalties and perspectives. This didn't have to happen, Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Her perfectly manicured hands fidgeted with her pearl necklace, the only visible sign of her distress. If you had come to us privately with your concerns, we could have managed this within the family. Like, you've managed everything else? I replied. Through manipulation, silencing, and carefully constructed appearances? Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You've never understood our world, Cassandra. The Maxwell legacy represents generations of influence, philanthropy, and leadership. Richard has protected that legacy through difficult times. By committing fraud? James interjected. By sacrificing his own son? That's not protecting a legacy, Eleanor. That's destroying its foundation. You, of all people, should understand the complexities involved. Eleanor turned to James, disappointment evident in her tone. Richard gave you everything. Mentorship, opportunity, position. You were practically a son to him. A son he was willing to discard the moment he needed a scapegoat, James countered. Richard doesn't want a family, Eleanor. He wants subjects, people who exist to amplify his image and execute his vision without question. Eleanor flinched at the assessment, but didn't deny it. Instead, she fixed her gaze on me. And what do you want, Cassandra? Control of Maxwell Financial? Revenge for years of feeling excluded? The satisfaction of seeing Richard humbled? The question gave me pause. What did I want from this confrontation? The answer crystallized with surprising clarity. I want justice, I said simply. For Thomas, who deserves recognition for his integrity. For the employees who would have lost livelihoods if Richard's schemes collapsed unchecked. For James, who compromised his values trying to earn approval that was never genuinely offered. And for yourself, Eleanor pressed, the acknowledgement that my worth isn't determined by Richard's assessment or by how well I conform to Maxwell expectations. Eleanor studied me thoughtfully, something shifting in her expression. You know, in another life, you might have made an excellent Maxwell. The financial maneuver you executed, acquiring controlling debt positions in less than 24 hours, it's precisely the bold strategy Richard would have admired in anyone but his daughter-in-law. Before I could respond, the boardroom door opened again. Victoria appeared, her expression carefully neutral. "We'd like all of you to join us now." We entered the boardroom to find Thomas standing by the windows, his posture rigid but his expression controlled. Richard remained seated at the head of the table, his habitual position of authority, though something in his demeanor had changed. A slight diminishment, as if the room's energy had shifted away from him. "After reviewing the documentation provided," Victoria began once we were seated, "the board has serious concerns about Maxwell Financial's current financial position and the discrepancies between our internal reporting and the actual state of our obligations." She glanced at the other board members who nodded in somber agreement. "If the Sentinel Partners report contains even half of what these documents suggest, Maxwell Financial faces not just a crisis of liquidity, but potentially regulatory investigation and shareholder litigation. All of which can be managed," Richard interjected, a shadow of his usual confidence. "Every financial institution faces periodic scrutiny, with proper legal representation and communication strategy." "We're well beyond communication strategies, Richard," Victoria interrupted firmly. "The board has a fiduciary responsibility to act in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. Given the circumstances, we've made 2 preliminary determinations." She paused, looking directly at Richard. "First, we are requesting your immediate resignation as CEO and chairman, along with any executives directly involved in misrepresenting the company's financial position." Richard's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. You have no authority to—" "Second," Victoria continued as if he hadn't spoken, "we are establishing an emergency restructuring committee to work with the debt holders, represented apparently by Mrs. Maxwell's consortium, to develop a recapitalization plan that will stabilize the company and preserve its viable operations." "You can't possibly believe that my son and his wife have the capability to restructure a financial institution of this complexity," Richard scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. "Actually," another board member spoke, the preliminary framework they've proposed is surprisingly sound. It maintains our core wealth management and commercial banking divisions while divesting the high-risk acquisition vehicles that have generated most of our recent volatility." "And who would lead this restructured company?" Richard demanded. "Surely not." "The board will conduct a proper executive search," Victoria stated. "In the interim, we're proposing that James Harrington serve as acting CEO, with Thomas returning to lead an expanded sustainable investment division." James looked stunned. That wasn't our suggestion. I'm not seeking—" "It was my recommendation," Victoria said. "You've demonstrated both financial acumen and, more importantly today, ethical clarity. Maxwell Financial needs both to survive. This crisis," Richard pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. "This is nothing short of a coup. I built Maxwell Financial from a regional investment firm into a global financial services leader. Without me, this company will collapse within months. Without correction, it will collapse within weeks," Thomas countered quietly. "The Sentinel report, the debt obligations coming due, the regulatory scrutiny that will follow. The only path forward is radical transparency and restructuring." Richard's attention fixed on me, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "And you, the girl from nowhere with her quaint community projects. You orchestrated this entire takedown, didn't you?" I met his gaze steadily. "You orchestrated your own downfall, Richard. I simply ensured it wouldn't destroy everything and everyone in its path." "Richard," Eleanor interjected, her social training finally failing as distress cracked through her perfect facade. "Perhaps we should consider the board's proposal. A dignified transition would preserve certain aspects of our position, our influence." "Our position?" Richard repeated incredulously. "There is no our position if these vultures strip me of my company." "Your company," Thomas noted quietly. "Not the family's company, not the shareholders' company. That distinction has always been the heart of the problem." Victoria cleared her throat. "We'll need your decision, Richard. If you refuse to resign voluntarily, the board is prepared to call an emergency shareholder meeting to remove you. Given the evidence we've reviewed, we believe that vote would succeed." Richard looked around the table, searching for allies and finding none. The board members who had for years deferred to his judgment now stared back with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. His gaze lingered on James, perhaps still processing the deepest betrayal from his perspective. The protégé he had groomed turning against him at the critical moment. "You'll regret this," he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "All of you. When this company falters without my leadership, when the restructuring fails because you've put faith in the wrong people, you'll wish you had stood by me." "Perhaps," Victoria acknowledged. "But we'll face those possibilities with clear consciences and transparent books." Richard's laugh was bitter. Integrity over success, the battle cry of mediocrity. "No," I corrected. "The foundation of sustainable success. Something you sacrificed long ago for the appearance of infallibility." Richard studied me with cold calculation. "You think you've won, don't you? That you've finally proven your worth by destroying what I built?" "This isn't about winning, Richard. It's about accountability." "Such noble sentiments," he sneered. "Let's see how they serve you when you're actually responsible for thousands of livelihoods." With that, he straightened his suit jacket, a reflexive gesture of composure, and faced the board one final time. "I hereby resign as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of Maxwell Financial Holdings, effective immediately. My attorneys will be in touch regarding the terms of separation." Without another word, without a glance at Thomas, James, or Eleanor, Richard Maxwell walked out of the boardroom that had been the center of his power for 3 decades. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow carried more finality than any dramatic slam. For a moment, no one spoke. The sudden vacuum of Richard's dominating presence left the room in suspended animation, as if everyone needed to recalibrate to a world where Richard Maxwell was no longer the gravitational center of Maxwell Financial. Victoria broke the silence. "We have considerable work ahead. The restructuring committee will need to convene immediately to prepare for tomorrow's market reaction to the Sentinel report." As the board began organizing next steps, Eleanor rose quietly. "I should go to him," she said, though whether from genuine concern for her brother or habitual loyalty was unclear. At the door, she paused, looking back at Thomas, James, and me. "Whatever happens next," she said, her voice carrying unusual emotion. "Remember that institutions can be rebuilt. Families are more fragile." With that cryptic caution, she followed, her brother's path out of the boardroom, leaving us to face the monumental task of salvaging what could be saved from the wreckage of Richard Maxwell's ambition. The 3 weeks following Richard's resignation were a whirlwind of activity. As predicted, the Sentinel Partners report triggered a stock market bloodbath for Maxwell Financial, with shares losing nearly 40% of their value in a single day. Financial news networks ran breathless coverage of the Maxwell meltdown, with experts debating whether the once mighty institution could survive. Behind the scenes, our hastily assembled restructuring team worked around the clock. James stepped into the acting CEO role with surprising confidence, addressing employees directly in a company-wide meeting where he acknowledged the failures of leadership and outlined a transparent path forward. Thomas led negotiations with key clients, steadying relationships that might otherwise have fled in the chaos. My role was perhaps the most unexpected. As the representative of the debt consortium, I became the de facto architect of Maxwell Financial's reorganization plan, working closely with Victoria and the board's restructuring committee to identify which divisions could be saved and which needed to be divested. "You have a remarkable talent for seeing the potential beneath the surface," Victoria observed during one late-night strategy session, surrounded by financial models and organizational charts. "It's exactly what Maxwell Financial needs right now." someone who can envision what it could become rather than clinging to what it was. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard had spent years dismissing my business acumen as quaint and small-scale, yet here I was, restructuring the very institution he had built and believed only he could manage. We established 3 core principles for the reorganization: transparency in all financial reporting, ethical investment practices, and sustainable growth rather than reckless expansion. The wealth management and commercial banking divisions, historically stable but neglected under Richard's acquisition spree, became the new foundation of the business. By the end of the 3rd week, we had stabilized the immediate crisis. The stock had recovered part of its losses as the market responded positively to our restructuring announcements. Regulators, satisfied with our proactive disclosures and remediation plans, had agreed to oversight rather than enforcement actions. Most importantly, we had preserved over 80% of the company's jobs, thousands of employees who would have been casualties in a complete collapse. Throughout this period, Richard remained conspicuously absent from both the company and family communications. He had retreated to his Nantucket compound, according to Eleanor, who maintained cautious contact with both camps in the family divide. It was Eleanor who arranged what she called a necessary family dinner at River Oak Country Club exactly 1 month after the boardroom confrontation. "Richard has requested this meeting," she explained when Thomas initially resisted. "He says there are matters that need to be addressed privately, as a family." "Is this an ambush?" I asked bluntly. "Has he assembled lawyers, allies, or counterattacked?" Eleanor sighed, looking suddenly older than her carefully maintained appearance usually allowed. "No, Cassandra. It's just dinner. There are consequences to acknowledge, relationships to define moving forward." And so we found ourselves back at the scene where the story effectively began. The exclusive dining room of River Oak Country Club, with its crystal chandeliers and impeccable service. James arrived first, then Thomas and I, and finally Eleanor, who entered alone. "Richard will join us shortly," she explained, taking her seat. "He wanted a moment to compose himself." The tension around the table was palpable. James fidgeted, with his water glass, a hint of his younger self showing through the executive facade. Thomas maintained outward calm, though I could feel the tension in his body beside mine. "Before Richard arrives," Eleanor said quietly, "I want to acknowledge something. I misjudged you, Cassandra. For years, I saw only what you weren't, not from our social circle, not from our kind of family, not educated in our institutions. I failed to see what you are: perceptive, principled, and remarkably capable." The unexpected acknowledgement caught me off guard. Before I could respond, the dining room doors opened, and Richard Maxwell entered. He had visibly changed in just 1 month. His perfectly dyed hair now showed strands of natural gray. His posture, while still proud, lacked the commanding presence he had cultivated for decades. Most noticeably, his expression carried something I had never seen before: uncertainty. He took his seat at the head of the table, a position of authority he assumed by habit rather than right. For a long moment, he simply looked at each of us in turn: Eleanor, James, Thomas, and finally me. "I've had a month to reflect," he began, his voice lacking its usual resonant confidence. "A month of watching from the sidelines as you," his gaze shifted between James and Thomas, "dismantled and rebuilt what I spent my life creating." "Not dismantled," Thomas corrected quietly. "Transformed. The core of Maxwell Financial remains intact." "Transformed," Richard repeated, testing the word like an unfamiliar taste. "Into something I no longer recognize or control. Into something sustainable," James added. "The quarterly reports show stability returning, client confidence rebuilding." Richard nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it entirely. His attention turned to me. "The debt consortium you assembled, I've been informed they've agreed to a 5-year restructuring plan with remarkably favorable terms. The goal was never to destroy Maxwell Financial, I reminded him, only to prevent you from destroying it yourself. A flash of the old anger crossed his face, quickly suppressed. Yes, well, your intervention has certainly achieved that much. Eleanor cleared her throat gently. Richard, you said you had things to address. He straightened, composing himself. Yes, 3 matters, specifically. He reached into his jacket, removing a folded document. First, I've instructed my attorneys to transfer my remaining shares in Maxwell Financial Holdings to a trust benefiting the company's employee retirement fund. I will retain no ownership interest in the company moving forward. The announcement stunned us into silence. Richard Maxwell voluntarily surrendering his ownership stake was inconceivable just weeks ago. Second, he continued into the silence, I've resigned my membership here at River Oak Country Club, along with my positions on various boards and committees throughout Boston. My presence would be a distraction to institutions I've long supported. Richard, that's not necessary, Eleanor began, but he raised his hand to silence her. It is necessary, Eleanor. My reputation in financial circles is irreparably damaged. Better to withdraw gracefully than become an embarrassment to organizations I respect. And third, Thomas prompted when Richard paused. Richard's expression shifted, something almost vulnerable crossing his features. Third, I owe apologies. To you, Thomas, for attempting to sacrifice your career to protect my reputation. To James, for treating your loyalty as an entitlement rather than a gift. To Eleanor, for dragging our family name through public disgrace. His gaze finally settled on me. And to you, Cassandra, for failing to recognize what should have been obvious from the beginning, that your different approach to business wasn't inferior, merely different. And perhaps, as recent events have demonstrated, more sustainable than my own. The acknowledgement, delivered without his usual condescension, felt like the closing of a chapter that had been open since I first entered the Maxwell family. What will you do now? James asked into the silence that followed. I've purchased a small property in Sedona, Richard replied. Desert living. Quite a change from Boston. I find I need perspective. Alone? Thomas asked, genuine concern in his voice despite everything. Richard glanced at Eleanor, something unspoken passing between them. For now, yes. Some journeys require solitude before companionship becomes possible again. As dinner progressed, the conversation gradually shifted from the painful past to the uncertain future, not with false reconciliation or pretended forgiveness, but with tentative steps toward a new understanding of what our family might become, not unified by Richard's dominating vision, but connected by more honest, if more complex bonds. When dessert arrived, Richard raised his glass in a toast that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. To Maxwell Financial Holdings, he said, his voice carrying a hint of genuine respect. May it thrive under new leadership with the wisdom I lacked when it mattered most. As glasses clinked around the table, I realized that Richard's acknowledgement of my worth hadn't come in the dramatic confrontation I had imagined, not in the boardroom showdown or the financial maneuvering that had given me leverage over his empire. It had come in this quiet moment, through the simple recognition that different values could create different but equally valid paths to success. Some victories arrive with thunderous applause and public vindication, others come more subtly, in changed perspectives and new possibilities. As I looked around the table at the transformed dynamics of the Maxwell family, I understood that true worth isn't measured by others' recognition, but by the impact of the principles we choose to uphold, even when, especially when, they come at a personal cost. Richard Maxwell had called me worthless, not knowing I held his financial future in my hands. But the real triumph wasn't in proving him wrong through power. It was in proving, through principled action, that worth transcends balance sheets and social standings, that it resides in the courage to stand for something more enduring than wealth or status. That, perhaps, was the most valuable lesson my father had taught me at our scratched kitchen table all those years ago. 6 months after that pivotal dinner at River Oak Country Club, Maxwell Financial Holdings had completed its remarkable transformation. The quarterly earnings report showed stable growth across restructured divisions, client confidence had fully rebounded, and financial analysts were cautiously touting the company as a model for ethical reform in the industry. I sat in my office, at Horizon Ventures, reviewing the final agreement that would transition our debt consortium's holdings back to Maxwell Financial at terms that respected both our investors' contributions and the company's renewed stability. The document represented the formal conclusion of my direct involvement in the Maxwell Financial restructuring, a strange milestone that brought both satisfaction and a surprising hint of melancholy. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Mia entered, carrying 2 coffee cups and a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked, placing the Financial Times on my desk, folded to display a prominent article. Maxwell Financial Phoenix from the Fiscal Flames. "James must be pleased," I observed, scanning the generally positive assessment of the company's turnaround. "He's navigated the transition better than anyone expected." "Including himself, from what I hear," Mia replied, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Thomas says James is considering accepting the permanent CEO position. The board's search committee approached him last week." This surprised me. I thought he viewed the role as temporary, a necessary intervention, not a career destination. "Apparently leadership suits him," Mia shrugged. "Or maybe having an ethical framework for his financial talents has unlocked something unexpected." I considered this, remembering how James had gradually lost himself in Richard's world, compromising values for advancement. Perhaps, in rebuilding Maxwell Financial according to different principles, he had also rebuilt something essential within himself. "What about your brother-in-law?" Mia asked, interrupting my thoughts. "Any update from the desert hermit?" "Richard is hardly living as a hermit," I corrected, smiling slightly at the image. "According to Eleanor, he's settled into Sedona quite comfortably. Hiking, reading philosophy, occasionally consulting with small businesses focused on sustainable practices." "Richard Maxwell consulting on sustainability?" Mia's eyebrows rose skeptically. "That's quite the reinvention. People can change when their foundation is shaken completely," I said, remembering Richard's transformed appearance at our family dinner. "Eleanor visits him monthly. She says he's different, reflective, less driven by status, more interested in legacy beyond wealth." "Do you believe that?" Mia asked, always the pragmatist. I considered the question seriously. "I believe he's genuinely reconsidering his values. Whether that translates to lasting change," I shrugged. "Time will tell." My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Meeting ended early. Lunch at Westford Gardens? Have news." "Go," Mia said, noticing my smile. "The debt transfer documents will wait. I'll review the draft in your absence." 30 minutes later, I found Thomas at our favorite table in Westford Gardens, a restaurant housed in a converted Victorian greenhouse that I had helped restore 3 years earlier. Sunlight filtered through glass panels above, illuminating the preserved architectural details that had initially attracted me to the property. "You're looking at your handiwork again," Thomas observed as I sat down, his eyes warm with affection. "Still satisfied with how it turned out?" "More than satisfied," I replied, glancing around at the thriving business. The original structure deserved preservation, and now it's serving a new purpose that respects its history while meeting contemporary needs. "A fitting metaphor for a lot of things," Thomas noted, reaching across the table to take my hand, "including Maxwell Financial." I studied his expression, noting an unusual energy. "You mentioned news?" 2 pieces, actually, he confirmed. First, the board unanimously approved the Sustainable Investment Division's expansion. We'll be tripling our portfolio over the next year, focusing on renewable energy infrastructure and affordable housing developments. That's wonderful, I replied, genuinely pleased. Thomas had fought for years to grow this division under Richard's regime, always facing resistance to what Richard deemed charity work masquerading as investment. The second piece is more surprising, Thomas continued. I've been asked to join the River Oak Country Club Board of Directors, specifically to chair their new Community Engagement Committee. I nearly choked on my water. River Oak? The bastion of exclusivity where your father once told me I didn't belong? That River Oak? Thomas nodded, clearly enjoying my reaction. Apparently, our family drama created unexpected ripples. Several board members were Maxwell Financial clients who appreciated how the restructuring preserved their investments. They've decided the club needs to evolve to remain relevant. Evolution at River Oak, I mused, shaking my head at the irony. What exactly does community engagement mean for an institution designed specifically to exclude community? That's what they want me to define, Thomas explained. Scholarship programs for local students, opening facilities to nonprofit events, creating genuine connections beyond the membership roster. And you're considering it? I asked, surprised by his interest in an institution that had symbolized so much of what we both opposed. I'm considering the opportunity for transformation, he clarified. Beautiful spaces shouldn't be hoarded by the few. Isn't that what you always say about your restoration projects? His use of my own philosophy made me smile. Touché, though I suspect some members will resist opening their exclusive doors. Undoubtedly, Thomas agreed, but others recognize that institutions that fail to evolve eventually become irrelevant. River Oak can maintain its historical character while serving a broader purpose. As we continued lunch, discussing the possibilities for River Oak's transformation, I realized how much had changed in just 6 months. The Maxwell name now represented something different in Boston's financial and social circles, not domination and exclusivity, but ethical reform and cautious evolution. Later that afternoon, I visited our textile mill redevelopment site, where construction was nearing completion on the mixed-income housing units. Walking through the spaces that would soon become homes for dozens of families, I felt the familiar satisfaction of preservation with purpose, my personal and professional philosophy made tangible. My phone rang, James calling, an increasingly common occurrence as our relationship gradually rebuilt itself on new foundations. The board accepted the debt restructuring terms, he said without preamble, his voice carrying genuine relief. Your consortium's proposal was more than fair. Some board members wondered why you didn't push for more advantageous terms given your leverage. Because destruction was never the goal, I reminded him. Only correction. A distinction Richard is finally beginning to understand, I think, James replied. Eleanor shared a letter he wrote her recently. He mentioned you, actually. Oh? I tried to sound casual, though my interest was piqued. He said watching Maxwell Financial grow stronger under the new framework has been a humbling education in the limitations of my vision. Coming from Richard, that's practically a sonnet of self-reflection. We both laughed, the sound echoing through the partially completed building around me. After we hung up, I continued my inspection of the property, noting areas where historical elements had been carefully preserved alongside modern adaptations, original beamwork exposed above, contemporary fixtures, factory windows restored to maximize natural light, salvaged wood repurposed into community spaces. This balance between honoring history and creating new purpose has always been at the heart of my approach to business. Now, unexpectedly, it had expanded beyond buildings to institutions like Maxwell Financial and River Oak Country Club, places I had once viewed as adversaries rather than opportunities for transformation. As the afternoon sun slanted through the mill's restored windows, I received an email from Eleanor Maxwell. The subject line read simply, An invitation. Cassandra, Richard has asked me to extend an invitation. He is returning to Boston briefly next month to formalize the transfer of several family properties to charitable foundations. He would appreciate a private conversation with you before he returns to Sedona. While he understands your hesitation given your history, he assures me this is neither a confrontation nor a negotiation, but an opportunity for closure he believes would benefit you. Both, whatever you decide, please know that my perspective of you has fundamentally changed. What I once mistook for incompatibility with our world, I now recognize as the courage to envision a different one. Respectfully, Eleanor stood in the mill's cavernous main hall, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my belief in transformation. A once abandoned building finding new purpose while honoring its historical significance. The invitation represented a similar opportunity on a personal level. Not to forget the past, but to acknowledge it while creating space for something new, to emerge. After a moment's reflection, I typed my response. Eleanor, please tell Richard I accept his invitation. Some conversations are worth having, even, perhaps especially, when they're difficult. Cassandra, I continued my inspection of the mill renovation. I reflected on the unlikely journey of the past year, from being dismissed as worthless to reshaping the very institutions that had once excluded me. I had discovered that true transformation rarely comes through destruction. It emerges through perseverance, principle, and the patient work of reimagining what existing structures might become when guided by different values. That was the lesson I would carry forward. In business, in family relationships, and in the eye. Continuing story, we were all still writing together. The Maxwell family estate in Beacon Hill stood as a monument to old Boston wealth, imposing limestone facade, wrought iron gates, and meticulously maintained gardens that remained hidden from public view behind high stone walls. I had visited this house many times over the years of my marriage to Thomas, but had never felt welcome within its walls. Today felt different. As I walked up the cobblestone path, I noticed subtle changes. The gates stood open rather than closed, and guarded. Several of the formal hedges had been removed, replaced with native plantings that softened the property's severe lines. Eleanor greeted me at the door herself, rather than dispatching staff as had been her custom. Cassandra, thank ye. You for coming. Her handshake had evolved into a brief embrace, still formal but genuine. Richard is waiting in the garden. He prefers it to the house these days. She led me through the mansion, which also showed signs of transition. Empty spaces on walls marked where valuable paintings had once hung, presumably now donated to the foundations Eleanor had mentioned. Family photographs had replaced some formal portraits, including several I had never seen before. Candid shots of Thomas as a child, playing baseball with his father. The back garden had undergone the most dramatic transformation. The formal English garden with its regimented hedgerows had been partially dismantled, creating an open space where native wildflowers now grew alongside the remaining traditional plantings, a symbolic blending of old and new. Richard sat at a small table beneath a maple tree, looking different than I remembered. His designer suits had been replaced by casual clothing, his meticulously styled hair now silver and slightly longer. Most noticeably, the perpetual tension that had once defined his posture was gone. He stood as we approached. Cassandra, thank you for coming. His voice carried none of the condescension I had grown accustomed to over the years. Eleanor excused herself discreetly, leaving us alone in the garden. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of our shared history filling the space between us. The mill project in South Boston, Richard finally said, gesturing for me to sit. Eleanor tells me it's nearly complete. I nodded, surprised by his opening. The first residents move in next month. The commercial spaces are already fully leased, a mix of local businesses and community services. I'd like to see it before I return to Arizona, he said. pouring tea from a simple ceramic pot. "Thomas speaks highly of what you've accomplished there." The conversation continued in this unexpectedly cordial manner, discussing various projects, the changes at Maxwell Financial, Thomas's new role at River Oak. Richard asked thoughtful questions and listened attentively to my answers, showing genuine interest rather than the dismissive tolerance I'd grown accustomed to. After nearly an hour, he set down his teacup and met my gaze directly. "I didn't ask you here for small talk, Cassandra, pleasant as it's been." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've spent the past 6 months in Sedona reassessing many things. My priorities, my relationships, the way I've measured success, and the value of others." He gestured toward the house behind us. "I'm transferring this property to a foundation Thomas and Eleanor will oversee. It will become a center for financial education and community development, teaching the principles of ethical investment that I should have prioritized long ago." "That's unexpected," I admitted, genuinely surprised by the scope of the change. "As was your intervention at Maxwell Financial," he replied, his tone thoughtful rather than accusatory. "I've had time to study what you and James accomplished there. The restructuring plan was elegant. You preserved what was worth saving, while discarding what wasn't working." He paused, looking out over the garden. "It's precisely what I failed to do for decades. I was so focused on expansion, on maintaining appearances, that I lost sight of foundational principles. The company is thriving now," I offered. "James has proven to be an exceptional leader." "Yes." Pride flickered across his face. "As has Thomas in his division, and you with your company. I failed to see the value in your approach because it didn't align with my narrow definition of success." He turned back to face me directly. "I was wrong about you, Cassandra. Not just about your business acumen, which is considerable, but about your character. You could have dismantled everything I built when you acquired that debt position. Instead, you chose preservation and renewal. That requires a kind of strength I'm only beginning to understand." The acknowledgement, delivered without qualification or expectation, was something I had once thought would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like the closing of a circle, meaningful but no longer essential to my sense of worth. "I appreciate that, Richard," I said simply, "but I didn't come here for an apology." "I know." He smiled slightly. "That's precisely why I needed to offer one." As our conversation continued, we didn't become instant friends or erase years of conflict. But we did establish something new, a foundation of mutual respect that would allow our family to move forward without the weight of old animosities. Later that evening, as Thomas and I walked along the Charles River at sunset, I shared details of the unexpected meeting. "So my father actually admitted he was wrong?" Thomas asked, genuine surprise in his voice. "I'm not sure I would have believed it if I hadn't seen the changes in him these past months." It was less about admitting he was wrong and more about recognizing different measures of value, I replied, considering the subtle but important distinction. "I think losing everything forced him to reevaluate what matters." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "James said something similar after the board meeting yesterday, that the new Maxwell Financial isn't just financially healthier than before, it's purposefully different." We paused at a familiar spot along the river, where 5 years earlier Thomas had proposed. The Boston skyline glittered across the water, the Maxwell Financial building no longer the tallest, but still prominent among the others. "The board officially approved our expanded sustainable investment division today," Thomas said, his expression quietly triumphant. "Triple the funding we had under my father, with explicit support for community development projects, including a partnership with Horizon Ventures." I looked at him in surprise. "You didn't mention that earlier." I wanted to propose it properly. He smiled, reaching for my hand. "A true partnership between our companies. Your expertise in community development, our financial resources, your vision, our infrastructure. the symmetry was not lost on me. This partnership representing a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. It's fitting, I said, watching the lights reflect on the water. Your father built his company by acquiring others and stripping them for parts. We're building something by bringing different strengths together. 2 weeks later, I stood with Thomas, James, and a small group of community leaders for the ribbon cutting. At the renovated textile mill, sunlight streamed through the restored windows, illuminating the original wooden beams we'd preserved alongside modern elements, a physical embodiment of my business philosophy. As I addressed the gathered crowd, I caught sight of an unexpected figure at the back of the room. Richard stood quietly beside Eleanor, observing without drawing attention to himself. Our eyes met briefly, and he nodded once. A simple acknowledgement between two people who had moved from adversaries to something not quite friends, but no longer enemies. Later, as we walked through the completed building together, the first time Richard had ever visited one of my projects, he paused in the central atrium where we'd preserved the mill's original clock tower mechanism as a sculptural centerpiece. You see the value in things others discard, he observed, studying the intricate gears now displayed as art. I spent decades tearing down the old to make room for the new. You find ways to honor what came before while creating something better. That's always been my approach, I acknowledged. Find what's worth preserving. Reimagine what isn't working. He nodded thoughtfully. It's a philosophy that extends beyond buildings. As we continued the tour, I reflected on the journey of the past year. From being dismissed as worthless to helping reshape the very institutions that had once excluded me. The true victory hadn't been in proving Richard wrong or in gaining control of his company's debt. It had been in staying true to my principles even when given the power to do otherwise. The real measure of worth, I had come to understand, wasn't found in wealth or social status, or even in others' validation. It lay in the courage to envision something better and the perseverance to build it, whether in business, in relationships, or in the careful renovation of what once seemed beyond repair. 2 years passed, bringing changes I could never have, anticipated on that fateful night at River Oak Country Club when Richard had dismissed me so casually. On a crisp autumn morning, I stood on the rooftop garden of what had once been Maxwell Financial's headquarters building. The space had been transformed from an exclusive executive retreat into a public urban garden, complete with community vegetable plots and educational spaces. Below, the Maxwell Center for Financial Education welcomed its first group of scholarship students, young people from neighborhoods like the one where I'd grown up, now learning financial literacy and ethical business practices in the very halls where Richard had once plotted high-risk acquisitions. Quite a view, isn't it? James joined me at the railing, his casual attire a marked contrast to the rigid suits he'd worn as Richard's protégé. Though he remained Maxwell Financial's CEO, he had reimagined the role, focusing on mentorship and strategic vision rather than dominance and control. Better than before, I agreed. More people get to enjoy it now. The building itself embodied the transformation of the Maxwell legacy. After the restructuring stabilized the company, James had made a bold decision to downsize the corporate headquarters, repurposing the excess space for community benefit. The company now occupied just 4 floors instead of 10, with the remainder converted to nonprofit incubators, educational facilities, and affordable office space for social enterprises. "Have you heard from Richard recently?" I asked, noticing the commemorative plaque nearby that acknowledged his founding of the company without glossing over the subsequent transformation. "He called last week," James confirmed. "He's coming east. For Thanksgiving. Says Sedona winters are colder than he expected. Or maybe he misses being part of what's happening here," I suggested. James smiled thoughtfully. "Maybe. He asked about the scholarship program, wanted details about the curriculum, the selection process, seemed genuinely invested. This didn't surprise me as much as it might have once. Richard's evolution had continued in unexpected ways. After initially retreating to Sedona to lick his wounds, he had gradually found a new purpose. Consulting with small businesses focused on sustainable practices and occasionally giving guest lectures on business ethics at a local college, using his own failures as cautionary examples. Thomas says the first phase of River Oaks Community Access Program is exceeding expectations, James noted, changing subjects. Membership was initially resistant, but the educational partnerships are winning converts. This represented another branch of our shared work to transform exclusive institutions. Thomas had spent the past year implementing his vision for River Oak Country Club, creating scholarship programs for local students, opening facilities to nonprofit events, and gradually shifting the culture from exclusivity to engaged stewardship. The old guard still complains, I replied with a slight smile. But they can't argue with the results. The youth golf program has identified 3 promising students who wouldn't have had access otherwise. My phone buzzed with a text from Mia. Final approval secured for Harborside. Breaking ground next month. Good news? James asked, noting my expression. The Harborside project finally cleared its last regulatory hurdle, I confirmed. Excitement, evident in my voice. It's our most ambitious development yet. The Harborside project represented everything I had been working toward throughout my career. A massive abandoned industrial complex being transformed into mixed-income housing, community spaces, and small business incubators. Most significantly, the financing model was revolutionary. A partnership between Horizon Ventures, Thomas's sustainable investment division at Maxwell Financial, and a community land trust ensuring long-term affordability. I should get downstairs. For the ribbon cutting, James said, checking his watch. Eleanor insists we start precisely at 11. Eleanor had surprised everyone by embracing the transformation of Maxwell Financial with unexpected enthusiasm. After initially supporting Richard through loyalty, she had discovered a genuine passion for educational philanthropy, now serving as the driving force behind the Maxwell Center for Financial Education. Thomas wants us all for dinner tonight, I reminded him as we headed toward the elevator. He's testing recipes for Thanksgiving. Including Richard? James asked, raising an eyebrow. Including Richard, I confirmed. First family dinner with everyone present since everything. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying us down to the main atrium where the gathered crowd awaited the official opening of the Education Center. Thomas stood near the podium, engaged in conversation with Eleanor and Victoria, the board members who had played such a pivotal role in the company's transformation. Nervous? Thomas asked as I joined them, taking my hand. About the center opening or dinner tonight? I replied with a small smile. Both, I suppose. I considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, the thought of Richard Maxwell sitting at our dinner table would have seemed impossible, a recipe for tension and old resentments. Now, it felt like a natural next step in the evolution of our family dynamic. Not nervous, I decided. Curious, perhaps, to see if we can truly build something new after everything that happened. Victoria, who had become a mentor and friend through the restructuring process, nodded approvingly. That's the real test of transformation, isn't it? Not just changing structures, but relationships. The ceremony itself was modest by previous Maxwell standards, but meaningful. Brief speeches, a focus on the students rather than the donors, and a clear vision for how financial education could serve as a tool for community empowerment rather than exclusion. As Eleanor cut the ribbon and the first students entered the center, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. From being dismissed as worthless to helping reshape the very definitions of value within the Maxwell world. It was a transformation I could never have engineered deliberately, yet somehow had helped catalyze through standing firm in my principles. That evening, our Cambridge home welcomed a gathering that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. James arrived first, bringing his new partner, Sarah, an environmental lawyer he had met during the Maxwell financial restructuring. Eleanor came next, bearing a heritage family recipe she had insisted on preparing herself rather than relying on staff. Richard arrived last, looking tan from his desert life, but somehow more at ease in his own skin than I had ever seen him. He brought no grand gifts or gestures, just a bottle of wine and a simple acknowledgement as he entered. "Thank you for including me." Dinner wasn't perfect or without moments of tension. Old patterns occasionally surfaced in Richard's interactions with Thomas, in Eleanor's instinctive social corrections, in James's reflexive deference to his former mentor. But these were now recognized, sometimes even gently acknowledged with humor rather than defensiveness. As conversation flowed from business to community projects to personal updates, I observed the subtle dance of a family rebuilding itself, not by forgetting the past or pretending wounds hadn't occurred, but by choosing to create something new from what remained. Later, as Richard helped me clear dishes, an act of domestic participation that once would have been beneath his consideration, he paused by the window overlooking our garden. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent decades believing value could only be measured one way, through wealth, power, social position. It was a remarkably limited perspective. What changed your mind?" I asked, genuinely curious about his internal journey. He considered the question carefully. "Losing everything, certainly. That creates clarity. But more importantly, watching what you, Thomas, and James built from the remains of what I thought was destroyed." He turned to face me directly. "You didn't just take control of Maxwell Financial's debt. You created a vision for what it could become that I never imagined." The acknowledgement wasn't about personal vindication anymore, but something more meaningful, recognition of different but equally valid measures of success. As the evening concluded and our guests departed, Thomas and I stood in our kitchen, the comfortable silence of long partnership settling between us. "That went better than expected," he observed. "It did," I agreed. "Not perfect, but authentic." And perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of the entire journey, that true worth isn't found in perfection or power or wealth, but in the authentic connections we forge, the principles we uphold, and the courage to envision something better, even when others can't yet see it. The path forward wouldn't always be smooth. Old habits and perspectives would occasionally resurface. The work of transformation, whether of buildings, institutions, or relationships, is never truly complete. But the foundation had been laid for something that honored the past while creating space for a different future, built on values that would endure long after the wounds of old conflicts had healed. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories, ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.